The silence of the South Carolina Lowcountry was never truly silent. It was a suffocating blanket, heavy with the humidity of the swamps and the distant, rhythmic thrum of crickets that seemed to mock anyone foolish enough to believe they were alone. But on this particular night, in the mid-1840s, there was a different sound, a sound so soft it could barely be distinguished from the rustle of palmetto leaves in the wind. It was the sound of 12-year-old feet, calloused, dirt-caked, and bleeding, pressing into the cooling mud of a plantation road. These were feet that had never known the comfort of shoes, and soon they would carry their owner into a darkness so profound that it would swallow the very concept of home. He did not look back at the master's house, for to look back was to invite the ghosts of his past to reclaim him. He only looked forward, toward a horizon he had only heard whispered about in the hushed, trembling voices of his elders, a place called the North, a place where the sun supposedly set differently, and where a man could own the very air he breathed. He was not yet a man. He was a child, small for his age, with eyes that had seen things that would wither the soul of any grown adult. His name was John Andrew Jackson, though on the plantation he was simply property, a digit on a ledger, a laboring body to be squeezed dry for the profit of another. The life he had known was one defined by the crack of the overseer's whip and the hollow ache of hunger that sat permanently in the pit of his stomach. It was a life where family was a fragile, temporary construct, easily shattered by the whim of a debt-ridden master. He had watched his mother's face as she was sold away, a memory that burned with more intensity than the sun beating down on the cotton rows. That day, the world had ended for him, and in the debris of his shattered childhood, a cold, hard resolve had begun to form. He did not know the geography of the country. He did not have a map, and he certainly did not have a destination, but he knew one fundamental truth. He would rather die walking toward a ghost of freedom than live one more hour in the graveyard of his own making. The woods ahead were a wall of obsidian, impenetrable and terrifying, but they were safer than the light of the plantation yard. Every step away from the overseer's cabin was a gamble against death. He moved with a feral instinct, knowing that the morning would bring the bloodhounds. He had heard their baying before, a low, guttural moan that heralded the end of hope for anyone who dared to run. If they found his scent, he knew the ending of his story would be swift and brutal. But John kept moving, his small, bare feet navigating the sharp roots and tangled vines of the forest floor, oblivious to the blood soaking the leaves behind him. He had no supplies, no rations, only the ragged shirt on his back, and a terror so pure it acted as fuel. What he didn't realize was that he was not just running from a plantation. He was stepping into a gauntlet that would stretch for 600 miles, a landscape where every stranger was a potential captor, and every shadow was a potential noose. The first 3 days were a blur of sensory deprivation and blinding fear. By day, he hid, burying himself in the dense, suffocating undergrowth, becoming one with the earth, trembling at the sound of a snapped twig or the distant clip-clop of a horse's hooves on a dirt road. He learned to drink from muddy creeks, cupping the stagnant water in his filthy hands, ignoring the film of rot on the surface. He learned to eat whatever nature provided, raw roots, berries he hoped weren't poisonous, and the occasional stolen ear of corn from the edge of a field. His body was failing him, muscles seizing from exhaustion, feet swelling to the point of agony, but his mind remained sharp, locked into a singular, agonizing focus. He was terrified, yes, but beneath the terror was a burning resentment, a quiet, smoldering rage that refused to let him stop. How many others had tried this? How many had made it this far, only to find the path blocked by the relentless cruelty of a system designed to crush the very idea of autonomy? He realized quickly that the road was the enemy. The main thoroughfares were where the patrollers lurked, men on horseback, armed with whips and guns, tasked with hunting down runaway property. These men were not just soldiers, they were scavengers, eager for the bounty that came with the return of a human being. John learned to traverse the ridgelines, to follow the flow of streams, to keep his silhouette low against the horizon. He became a ghost in his own land, invisible to the eyes of those who assumed he was just another face in the field. But as the days bled into weeks, the physical toll began to manifest in terrifying ways. His feet, raw and shredded by the jagged terrain of the South Carolina foothills, began to fester. Every step became a negotiation with pain, a test of will that threatened to break him. He would lie in the damp moss at night, unable to sleep, staring up at the canopy of leaves, wondering if the stars were the same ones his mother had looked at, and if, somewhere out there, she was looking up at the same heavens, wondering if her boy was still breathing. The wilderness was not just his hiding place. It was his confessional. In the crushing solitude of the backcountry, John spoke to the trees, to the shadows, to the God he had heard the preachers speak of but never felt. He asked why the world was built this way, why a child had to walk through hell to be considered a human being. There were moments of near discovery that would have frozen his blood. The time a carriage passed so close he could smell the expensive tobacco smoke of the passenger. The time he stumbled upon a campfire and had to freeze, holding his breath until his lungs burned, while two men laughed and discussed the price of slaves. It was in these moments that he understood the true magnitude of what he was attempting. He wasn't just walking, he was defying an entire social order, an economic engine, and a moral vacuum that stretched across half a continent. And with every mile he covered, the question became more urgent. Was freedom a place, or was it a state of mind that he was slowly, agonizingly earning for himself? One evening, deep in the mountains, the temperature plummeted. For a boy from the sweltering heat of the coast, the cold was a foreign, hostile entity. He had no blanket, no fire, and his clothes were tattered rags that offered no insulation against the biting mountain air. He curled into a ball at the base of a hollowed-out oak tree, his teeth chattering so violently he feared his jaw would shatter. The isolation of the mountain night was absolute, a heavy, velvet void that seemed to press in on his small frame. He thought of the plantation kitchen, the warmth of the hearth, the companionship of the other children. Even the miserable, crushing labor seemed like a luxury compared to the terrifying emptiness of the wild. Was this the price of liberty? To die alone, frozen and forgotten in a wilderness that didn't care if he lived or died? He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment he drifted toward the seductive pull of giving up. But then a sound broke the stillness, a faint, rhythmic hoot of an owl. It was a sound of life, of survival, of a creature that belonged here. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. He would not be a statistic. He would not be a casualty of the woods. He survived the night by sheer force of will, waking to a sunrise that painted the mountain peaks in shades of bruised purple and gold. As he descended into the valleys, the landscape began to change, becoming more rolling, more agricultural, but the threat remained. He had to cross rivers, their waters swollen and freezing, wading through currents that threatened to pull his emaciated body under. Each river crossing was a desperate, shivering struggle, holding his few meager belongings above his head, fighting the temptation to just let go and be swept away into the dark, churning depths. He learned to read the landscape, to look for the North Star, which his mother had once pointed out to him as a child, though he hadn't understood its significance then. Now, it was his compass, his lighthouse, the only constant in a world that sought to keep him perpetually lost. It was during these middle weeks of his journey that John encountered the true nature of humanity. He had been conditioned to view all white men as potential oppressors, their very presence a signal of impending violence. But as he skirted the edges of small, isolated farming communities, he began to see another reality. He saw a man plowing a field, stopping to share a crust of bread with a stray dog. He saw a woman hanging laundry, her face lined with the same weary exhaustion he felt in his own bones. These were not masters, they were laborers, trapped by their own cycles of poverty and struggle. He dared not speak to them, but watching them from the periphery of the woods, he realized that the system of slavery was not just a chain around his neck. It was a toxin that poisoned the entire society. It made men cruel and women fearful, creating a culture built on suspicion and dominance. He realized he was not just running from a master, he was running from a contagion. The terror of the hunt never truly faded, though. The rumors of runaway property traveled faster than the speed of travel. At one point, he narrowly avoided a group of men on horseback by flattening himself into the mud of a ditch, burying his face in the filth as the horses trotted past. He could feel the vibration of their hooves in the earth, a rhythmic pounding that felt like his own heartbeat magnified. If they had looked down, if they had paused for even a second, it would have been over. He lay there for hours after they passed, shivering, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He began to understand that every successful mile he put behind him was a miracle, a defiance of the odds that grew more astronomical with each passing day. He was a 12-year-old child against the might of an empire of iron and blood, yet here he was, still breathing, still moving. As the weeks turned into months, his body underwent a transformation. The soft, vulnerable frame of a child was hardening, becoming corded with muscle and scar tissue. His feet had become so calloused that they were like leather, able to traverse sharp rocks and thorns with a numbness that bordered on supernatural. But his mind was changing too. He was no longer just the boy who had run away. He was becoming a man who understood the architecture of his own oppression. He saw the borders of states as invisible lines that meant everything and nothing at all. He saw the geography of the country not as a map of potential, but as a series of obstacles designed to hem him in. And he began to wonder what the destination actually looked like. He had dreamed of the North as a paradise, a land of milk and honey. But what if he arrived and found that he was still, in the eyes of the world, just an object? The uncertainty of the future began to rival the terror of the past. The journey was not just a test of endurance, it was a journey into the heart of his own identity. Who was John Andrew Jackson without the label of slave, without the constant instruction and the dehumanizing gaze of an overseer? He had to invent himself from scratch. He had to learn how to be free in a world that demanded he be bound. He found himself talking to himself constantly, narrating his own life, building a sense of self-worth that had been systematically denied to him. He was not property. He was a witness. He was a traveler. He was a survivor. These words, whispered into the cold mountain air, became his armor. He was crafting a narrative that he would eventually tell to the world, a story that would serve as his testimony against the horrors he had fled. The transition from the south to the north was not a sudden boundary. There was no gate, no wall, no signpost that declared free soil. It was a gradual, deceptive change. The people looked the same, the roads were the same, but the atmosphere began to shift, ever so slightly. He encountered people who treated him with a suspicion that wasn't murderous, but merely dismissive. He was no longer an object of prey, but he was an object of curiosity, an anomaly. He had to learn to navigate this new, confusing landscape where he was technically free, but functionally isolated. He was like a bird that had escaped its cage only to realize the sky was vast, cold, and entirely indifferent to his flight. He had to find a way to eat, to clothe himself, to survive in a society that had no place for him, even if it didn't explicitly want him dead. Then came the day the landscape truly broke. He walked over a ridge and saw a valley that looked different, more industrial, busier, with the smoke of factories rising into the gray sky. He sensed, rather than knew, that he had crossed into the north. His legs, which had carried him through 600 miles of terror, began to tremble, not from exhaustion, but from a wave of emotion so overwhelming he had to collapse to his knees. He hadn't just run. He had escaped the gravitational pull of the plantation. He had walked out of a nightmare and into a life that was entirely his own. But as he sat there, weeping silently in the tall grass, he looked down at his feet, the same feet that had walked 600 miles without shoes. They were mangled, scarred, and permanently altered by the journey. He realized that while he had left the physical shackles behind, the memory of the weight would be with him forever. He reached a town, exhausted and famished, his body nearing the point of total collapse. He was found by a local, a person who didn't see a runaway slave, but a starving child. He was given food, warm, simple sustenance that tasted like heaven, and he was given a pair of shoes. He stared at the leather, hesitant to touch them, feeling as though he was unworthy of such luxury. When he finally put them on, the sensation was foreign, confining, almost painful. He had grown accustomed to the ground, to the connection between his skin and the earth. Now, shielded from the road, he felt a strange, detached sense of safety. He was free. The word echoed in his mind, huge and terrifying and beautiful. He had made it. But the triumph was tempered by the realization that while he was free, his mother was still there. His siblings were still there. The hundreds of thousands of people he had left behind were still trapped in the same nightmare. He had just escaped. In the years that followed, John Andrew Jackson did not fade into obscurity. He transformed his trauma into a weapon. He learned to read and write, mastering the language of his captors to dismantle the system that had birthed him. He wrote his memoir, The Experience of a Slave in South Carolina, a document that would become a searing indictment of the institution of slavery. He traveled, he spoke, and he forced the world to look at the man behind the property. He didn't just tell the story of his walk, he told the story of the miles, the blood, the hunger, and the quiet, desperate hope that drove him forward. He became a voice for the voiceless, a man who had walked 600 miles to prove that the spirit of freedom could not be chained, could not be broken, and could not be forgotten. But what of the child who walked those miles? Whenever he looked down at his own feet, John Andrew Jackson didn't just see scars. He saw the road. He saw the mud of South Carolina, the thorns of the mountain passes, the freezing rivers of the north. He saw the resilience of a human spirit that refused to be defined by its oppressors. He understood that his freedom was not a gift, it was an achievement, a conquest of the highest order. He realized that the 600 miles had not just changed his geography, they had changed his very soul. He had started the journey as a piece of property, and he had finished it as a man who owned himself completely. The story of the boy who walked 600 miles without shoes is not just a tale of escape, it is a testament to the endurance of the human will. It asks us, across the chasm of history, to consider what we would do if our humanity was stripped from us. Would we run? Would we endure? Would we keep walking, even when the path was nothing but shadow, and the destination was nothing but a hope? John Andrew Jackson's life reminds us that history is not just made of battles and legislation, it is made of individual acts of courage, of small, quiet steps taken in the dark, of the refusal to accept a reality that says you are less than human. As we look back at his life, we are forced to confront the chilling reality that his struggle was not unique, yet his survival was an anomaly. For every John Andrew Jackson who made it to the northern soil, there were countless others who were lost to the woods, to the rivers, to the despair of the journey. His journey is a mirror that reflects the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human resilience. It challenges us to never be complacent about the freedoms we hold, for they were bought with the blood and the, often, unrecognized sacrifices of those who walked before us. The silence of the South Carolina low country is not really silent. If you listen closely, if you stand on those old, forgotten roads and quiet the noise of the modern world, you can almost hear it. The rhythmic, persistent, defiant pad of feet against the earth. It is the sound of a 12-year-old boy reclaiming his life, one step at a time, moving toward a horizon that finally promised him the only thing that ever truly mattered, his own name. And as long as we remember his story, as long as we carry the memory of those 600 miles, he is not just a footnote in a history book. He is a testament to the fact that while chains can bind the body, the human spirit, given enough room to run, will always, eventually, find its way home. The path he took is long gone, swallowed by time, by industry, and by the inevitable march of progress. But the journey itself is eternal. It is the journey of every person who has ever looked at the walls around them and chosen to walk through the fire to find the other side. John Andrew Jackson died years later, but his legacy, his written word, and the memory of his walk remain as a beacon. He walked so that he could be human, and in doing so, he taught us what it means to be truly free. It is a lesson that is never finished, a journey that never truly ends. For as long as there is injustice, there will be those who, like that 12-year-old boy, will choose to lace up their resolve and walk, barefoot and unafraid, into the dark, searching for the dawn. The question is not just what he went through to get there, but what we are willing to do to ensure that no one ever has to walk that long, lonely, barefoot road again. That is the true weight of his steps, the true legacy of his survival, and the enduring mystery of his incredible, impossible, and haunting journey into the light.